Everyone, welcome to my channel. In today's video, I am super excited to share with all of you my review of Hourglass's latest release. So they came out with 3 palettes and 4 packagings. I got the customized packaging of the Owl palette. Inside I have the Color Story 1. So that is the lightest color story that's normally in the Jellyfish palette. But I decided to go with the Owl packaging because I thought this one was the most beautiful. So in today's video, I'll be going through swatches, demos, and comparison swatches of this Jellyfish palette. And then also I happen to have almost all of the shades in the Leopard palette as well. That's the second color story for medium skin tones, and arguably the color story that I think would work best for my skin tone. And so I'm going to demo that on half of my face as well, so you guys can compare those two. So hopefully this is helpful for any of you who are curious about this latest release. So let's start out with the beautiful packaging. Here's the box, and the palette has a 12-month shelf life. And here we have the glorious palette itself, so pretty. If you guys picked up any of the animal print packagings from the previous release, it is that same metal packaging. And on the back, all of the shades are listed. Let's open this up. So here we have the beautiful color story. I think it's going to be a little bit light for my skin tone, but hopefully I can still make it work. Super, super gorgeous though. So before we put these powders on my face, as you can tell, I have no makeup on at the moment. And so I did want to actually demo for you guys the new Hourglass skin tint. I went to Sephora today and picked up a little sample of this because I wanted to do as close as possible to a full face of Hourglass. So I have this in shade 5. This is going to be my first time trying this skin tint. I've heard really rave reviews about this. But to be completely honest, I don't always get along the best with Hourglass complexion products. I really love their powders, which is why I picked up so many of their ambient lighting palettes. But when it comes to complexion, last year in my video featuring their holiday palettes, I used a sample of their concealer, and that was just a little bit too drying for me. It looked really cakey on my skin. And then I have tried their foundation, which a lot of people really love, but unfortunately for me, that was also just a little bit too drying, and the shade match wasn't that great either. I'm hoping though, given that this product is supposed to be a bit more glowy, that it might work better with my normal to dry skin type. Alright, so here we have just one layer on this side, nothing on this side of my face. I think it provided some degree of evening, though you can tell that this is definitely pretty light coverage and basically didn't really do anything for my blemish there. So let's go in with a bit more. I mean, I don't think this is meant to provide that much coverage. I think it's supposed to be like a sheer everyday skin tint. But for the purposes of today's video, I'm going to try to build it up a little bit more just so we can see how much coverage this can provide. And also because I am going to be relying on this as my primary base product, though I will go in with a little bit of concealer as well. On the plus side, I think this shade match is actually okay for me, at least given how sheer the product is. In store, I was a little bit worried this might be too warm for me because Hourglass doesn't really have that many neutral tones. So shade 5 is like light, medium, warm. And for me, I have a pretty neutral undertone. But I think given this level of sheerness, it's okay. So here we have 2 layers, and I think this is where I'm going to stop for today. I think it looks pretty good. Definitely concealed a little bit of my redness, but I'm definitely also going to need some concealer on top of this. The finish though is super pretty, very dewy, very hydrated looking. So overall a fan of how it's looking thus far. So I went off camera to do my brows and apply some concealer. I went in with my Hourglass brow pencil and my Charlotte Tilbury brow gel and my Natasha Denona concealer. And as always, all the products will be linked in my description box in case you guys are interested. So before we get into the palettes, I also wanted to try out this little sample I got of the setting powder from Hourglass. So this is something I got from their website. This is a deluxe mini of their little setting powder. And I think this will be quite handy because the base is definitely looking quite luminous right now. And even though we're going to go in with a lot of powders, I find that setting it just makes it a little bit easier for the powders not to catch on the base and just allows for a smoother application. So I'm gonna go in with my Kanoki brush from Sonia G and just take a little bit of this powder. It is super teeny tiny, and just sweep this around my eyes. First, I'm going to just focus on the areas where I have concealer, and then I'm just going to kind of apply it all over. And this is also a good time to explain the difference between setting powder and finishing powder. So in these ambient lighting palettes, they include finishing powders, which I'll demo for you guys as well today, but that is distinct from setting powders in that the setting powder basically mattifies your face, sets your complexion products, helps ensure they're not going to slip and slide over the course of the day, and especially if you're using a more dewy complexion product like I am today, setting powder is really helpful to ensure that all of your other powder products will just glide seamlessly on top of your base. And in contrast, the goal of finishing powder is, as the name implies, to finish your look. So usually you use that as a last step, basically to buff all of your face products together. You can use it all over your face, and it's more about the finish it leaves your skin in terms of being really nicely luminous, very well blended, very blurring. And so they have somewhat similar purposes in that both of them leave a different finish to the skin, but you use them at different points. And if you just use finishing powder, then especially if you have any oiliness in your skin, chances are that's going to come out over the course of the day, because finishing powder is not going to combat that the way that setting powder does. Alright, so here is my lightly set face. I didn't put on that much because I wanted to preserve the luminosity of the skin tint, and I think you can still see that really nicely. But I just wanted to make sure that the powders weren't going to just immediately catch on my skin. I also went in with Glowing Jen from Charlotte Tilbury. So without further ado, let's get into the star of today's show. So here we have Color Story 1. Let me first give you guys some swatches. So I'm going to start by swatching the finishing powders. This one over here is Diffused Light. This is not a new shade. In fact, this is one of the most popular shades of finishing powders from Hourglass. And I do have this in my collection already. Next we have Ethereal Light. This one is also not new, but this one is new to me. So that made this palette a little bit more attractive in that at least one of the finishing powders was new to me. Though if you look at them, they are quite similar. I would say Diffused Light, the first one, has a bit more of a yellow undertone, whereas Ethereal Light just looks straight up white. I am curious how this is going to look on my skin tone, and that these are very light. Hopefully with a light hand though, they won't add too much brightening. So next we have the Blush Rose Fusion. So this is a new blush, really gorgeous. I'm excited about this because I love rose toned blushes. And then we have the blush Diffused Heat. So this one is not new, and I believe I already have this in my collection. So we can see that in one of the other palettes as well. And then for highlight, we have Metallic Strobe Powder Opal Strobe Light. This is a new highlight and really beautiful. It has a wonderful pinky undertone to it, which is quite unique in my Hourglass collection. You can see this metallic strobe light has quite a bit of punch as well. And then finally we have the bronzer, which is in a new shade, Lunar Bronze. And this was also one of the aspects that really attracted me to this palette, because this is a bit more of a neutral bronzer in comparison to some of the previous Hourglass releases. And personally, I love neutral bronzers and find that a lot of Hourglass ones are a bit warm for my taste. So here we have the overall palette swatched. It's a pretty consistent color story, so very rosy. You're not going to get a ton of diversity in looks. but very, very pretty. Definitely coheres well together. So I'm going to put this palette on the left side of my face. So I'm going to start out with the bronzer on my Sonia G Fan L brush, which is a little bit large for this purpose. But let's just use this to add a little bit. Oops, wow. Okay, that actually applied quite a bit. Even though this is for the lightest skin tones, I feel like actually this bronzer packs quite a punch, at least with this brush. So I think with that one dip, I can use it across my entire face actually. Very pretty though. Okay, buffed out, it's a lot less intimidating. Really gorgeous shade. I am very much enjoying this because I feel like it has much more of that neutral, almost slightly rosy undertone in comparison to most Hourglass bronzers. I'm just going to reduce the brightness a little bit so hopefully you guys can see that clearly. This side with the bronzer, this side without. I'm also going to go in with my Fan A brush, which is perfect for nose contour. And just going to slide this along this side of my nose. And again, it actually packs quite a punch, which I'm a little bit surprised of. I think if you have very fair skin, you probably want to use a slightly less dense brush than these fan brushes that I'm using today. But it does mean that even if you have a medium skin tone, I think you could make this bronzer work for you. Now moving to the blush, I'm going to first go into the new blush shade, which is a bit deeper, and put that on the outer portion of my cheek. Ooh, very pretty. Okay, this one definitely, at least applied with the squirrel hairbrush, is letting me build it up gradually, which is my preference. But look how pretty that is. That's such a nice natural flush to the skin. Ooh, really gorgeous. Now turning that brush over, I'm going into diffused heat. This one is not new, but still really pretty. Wow. Okay, so this is a very similar shade. I would say, honestly, you probably can't see that much of a difference on my skin, but this one is lighter and also much more shimmery. So I think if you're using this as a cohesive palette, they do go well together in that you can apply them the way I'm doing now, where the shimmery one is kind of towards the center of the face and the more matte one is further back. Let me actually just go in with a little bit more of that rose flush up here. But yeah, both of these are very buildable in terms of pigmentation. So whereas the bronzer came on a little bit heavy, both of these are really, really light in comparison. And now let's go in with this highlight. I hope this works on my skin tone because it is a little bit bright. Whew, yeah, that is definitely pretty bright. So I do have sort of a neutral to more yellow based skin tone. And so I think this sort of very pinky shade does tend to pop a lot against my skin. Not a problem, but just something to note. Okay, I don't really see any cast at least, but definitely I would say I probably would only wear this with kind of pink toned blushes because I think otherwise it would contrast too much. And you can see a little bit of this highlight really goes quite a long way. So now let's get into these finishing powders. So I'm going to first go in with this ethereal light one because this one is new to me. And let's see, I'm going to first just put this on my forehead and the high points of my face because it does have a little bit more shine. It's a bit lighter than the other one. Just want to see if it comes across too light. And so far so good. I don't think it's actually too light on my complexion by any means. I mean, you can see there's a little bit of brightening, I think, on the center of my face where I applied it here in comparison to this side, but it doesn't look white at all, which is great. Now let me go in with this diffused light, which usually I use this shade on the center of my face, but today I'm going to use this on the boundaries. And I think this is fine too, actually. I'm not experiencing any issues putting this along the perimeter of my face. So there we go. That looks really nice, and hopefully you guys can see a little bit of the difference in finish now. So on this side I have this palette basically all over, and it's a little bit less obvious maybe on camera in comparison to in person, but on this side in person there's still a little bit more of that dewiness coming through. It still looks a little bit wet, whereas here everything looks almost filtered, so you really can't see the base product as distinctly. Everything is just sort of melded together, and it almost has a little bit more of like a marble finish to it in comparison to this side. So if you want a really natural look, this side maybe looks slightly more natural, but this side definitely looks way more perfected and filtered. So to further illustrate these shades, I'm also going to just use this palette as eyeshadow today, so you can see what the shades look like built up. So first I'm going in with the bronzer and just sweeping this throughout my crease. This is something I really like doing when I'm traveling as well. I love bringing these Hourglass palettes, and I think they work really well for a natural look because you can use them as a face palette and then also use them all over the eyes as well, just for a very simple everyday look. In fact, you could just kind of leave it at this with the bronzer, and this would be kind of like the simplest eye look that you could do. But of course today I'm going to go a little bit further just because I want to show you guys how all the shades look on the eyes. So now I'm going to go into the Rose Flush shade, and I'm going to put this kind of on the outer portion of my eyes. You can see that even though this looks super pigmented in pan, it is much lighter and more sheer when applied to the face. So I'm just kind of putting this on the center to outer half of my eyes. And then turning that brush over, I'm going into this diffused heat shade, putting this on the center part. So hopefully you guys can just see these are very similar shades. This one, diffused heat, is just a little bit lighter and has a tiny bit more shine to it, though honestly on the eyes they look very similar. Go back in with that crease brush just to zhuzh out the edges. And then with my mini booster from Sonia G, I'm going in the highlight shade in the inner corner and maybe sweeping a little bit of that over as well. You can see just how much more shine this has in comparison to the blush shades. And then I'm going to use this as brow bone highlight, the Ethereal Light. So you can see how that just adds a little bit more light to the look. And then on the lower lash line, I'm going to go into the highlighter and just sweep this on the inner third. And then take a bit of this rose shade again and put this on the middle, just to help match the top and bottom. So here we have this super simple, easygoing eyeshadow look that matches with the rest of the face. So now let's go into my DIY Leopard palette. So I have here all the shades pulled up. So first off, we have Dim Light. So I have that over here in my Sculpture 6 palette. So that's this shade over here. I do really enjoy this finishing powder and use it quite a lot. As you can see, it's very similar to my skin tone. I don't know if you guys will even really be able to pick it up. It's just a little bit more rosy than my skin tone, but the depth is super similar. Side note, we have diffused light in this palette as well, which is what we had in this new palette. The other exact dupe in this palette is the Mood Exposure Blush. This is possibly my all-time favorite blush. It doesn't look like much in swatch. It honestly doesn't show up super well in swatch form, but this is possibly my most used blush because I just love this for any professional makeup occasion where I want to look a little bit more alive, a little bit more flushed, but I still want to look very polished and professional. Basically, this Sculpture palette is the palette I always bring with me when I'm traveling for work because it's a perfect way to just look a bit more alive in your complexion without really looking like you have much makeup on. Next, I have the Tiger palette from last year, which has the Iridescent Rose Blush shade. This is also in Leopard. Swatch that over here. This is a much more shimmery blush in comparison to Mood Exposure and is more rosy in tone, whereas Mood Exposure is a bit more mauvey. For the bronzer, I have the Elephant palette, also from last year, and this bronzer, Lustrous Bronze Light, is repeated in the Leopard palette this year. And you can see here that this is a lot warmer and also has shimmer in contrast to the bronzer in the Jellyfish palette, which is more neutral and does not have shimmer in it. So those are the exact shade matches I have. So I don't actually have Celestial Strobe Light, which is the highlighter, but I figure it's probably quite similar to a lot of the other strobe lights. So for example, here I have Champagne Strobe Light. I mean, I have a lot of strobe light powders from Hourglass. So I'm going to just swatch Champagne Strobe Light here since I think it gives a very similar effect to what we're seeing in the Leopard palette. The Leopard palette one just looks a little bit more golden, but all of these strobe light powders tend to look similar on the skin. And then the one new shade in this palette is Ethereal Flush, which of course I don't have since I don't have this palette, but I do have a lot of kind of similar corally blushes from Hourglass. In particular, I feel like this shade Iridescent Coral is somewhat similar perhaps to this shade, so I'm gonna just swatch it here so you guys can see. Again, I don't have that shade, so I can't say for sure, but they do look quite similar online at least. So here we have the duped Leopard palette with these 4 shades being the exact dupes, and then these 2 just being substitutes that I'll use today. So let's start like we did on the other side with bronzer. So I'm going to go in with my Sonia G Detail brush into my Elephant palette and just sweep this bronzer on my face. And I think you can already see that this bronzer is just a little bit warmer than on the other side. And for context, the reason I decided this year to just pick up 1 instead of 2 of the palettes like I did last year is I honestly haven't gotten that much use out of the Elephant and Tiger palettes that I picked up last year. I do enjoy both of them and do think this formulation from Hourglass is really impeccable. But the reality, at least for myself, is because I have several of these palettes at this point, I really only use the ones that I like the most on a regular basis. And for me, that's actually the ones from the Sculpture collection, especially the 6-pan Sculpture. That is my most used palette by far in terms of face palettes. And so as much as I do like the Elephant and the Tiger ones, I just don't get much use from them. And so this year, because the Leopard was basically all repeat shades, I wasn't going to go for that one just to get 2 new shades. And then I was very attracted by the Snake palette, but realistically, I barely used this Tiger palette, which was last year's deeper skin tone friendly palette, just because I do find it picks up so easily that it's not really my preference in terms of how to apply makeup. I prefer to have shades that just slowly build up instead of picking up a ton at a time. And so as a result this year, I decided to just control myself and go in with 1 palette, even though I was super tempted by the animal packaging and wanted to pick up all of them. So here we have the bronzer on this side of my face, and you can see, I think, quite a significant difference actually between the 2 sides of my face. This side is just a lot warmer, and indeed it kind of comes across a little bit deeper as a result as well, in comparison to this side, which is just a lot more neutral, leaning cool toned. Now with my Designer Pro brush from Sonia G, I'm going into this Iridescent Coral shade, and I'm going to put this on the outer portion of my cheeks. Normally I would put this one, which is the more shimmery one, kind of closer to the center of my face, but because this one is a lot more pigmented than Mood Exposure, I figured I'd put on the outer portion. So you can see that is super pretty. Honestly, it's very similar to the shades on this side as well, just a little bit warmer, but both sides definitely have that sort of rosy vibe going. And then turning my brush around, I'm going into Mood Exposure, which is, as I mentioned, one of my favorite blushes, Super light, as you can see. Definitely you don't have to worry about putting too much of this on, but really gorgeous cool tone blush. I feel like there aren't enough cool toned blushes on the market. And you can see these two, even though they're kind of blended together in today's look, they're actually quite distinct in that this one's so much more red, coral, leaning warm toned, whereas this one is very cool toned in contrast. So I guess one good thing about this Leopard palette is you do have those options in terms of either cooler toned or warmer toned blushes. And I don't know if you guys are going to be able to see much with this, but I will add a little bit of this shade as well, just kind of in the center, because this is my dupe of that Ethereal Flush shade, which is brand new. So I'm just going to put that here so you can sort of see what it might look like. Of course, this is not that shade, but I think on the face, it probably would look not that dissimilar. All right, so in general, I think you can see on this side, the blushes are looking a bit more pigmented in comparison to this side. Still really beautiful, but definitely more in your face. And then for highlight, I'm gonna just go into this Champagne Strobe. Ooh, okay, actually picked up quite a lot. Let's take some of that off. And then just sweep this along the high points of the cheeks. Super, super pretty. This is the same formulation on this side, but I think you can see because this one's so much cooler toned, the one on this side kind of melts into my skin a little bit more, whereas this one really stands out. And now, unlike the other side, this palette only comes with one finishing powder. So I'm going to go in with my Sonia G Buffer Pro, which is a little bit big for this purpose, but go into my exact dupe and just sweep this kind of all over my face, just to buff everything together, avoid any harsh lines. And this will also just kind of help both sides look more evened out, I think. There we go. So this side has my Leopard dupe, and this side has the Jellyfish / Owl. So now let's go into the eye look to even things out. So once again, I'm going in with the bronzer, this time from the Elephant palette, and sweeping this throughout my crease. This looks a lot more orangey than on the other side. I'm actually kind of surprised that I feel like the bronzer in the Jellyfish is actually a bit deeper than the one in Leopard, even though Leopard is supposed to be for medium skin tones. I don't know, what do you guys think? I feel like this one, in addition to being warmer, is just a tad bit lighter. Maybe because it has the shimmer in it. I'm going to also sweep this along my lower lash line. And then I'm going in with this iridescent coral shade and putting this on the outer portion of my eyes. This one actually works pretty well as eyeshadow. You can see just how much more pigmentation this has in comparison to the blushes in Jellyfish. Turning that brush over, I'm going into Mood Exposure, putting that in the inner portion, and you can see just how light Mood Exposure is in contrast. They are really pretty next to each other. And then I'm going to use some of this Ethereal Flush dupe on the bottom, just to bring a little bit of that coralness to the lower lash line. And then going in with the strobe powder in the inner corner, similar to the other side, and a bit on the lower lash line as well. And then taking that finishing powder and using it as brow bone highlight. Now this one doesn't quite highlight the brow as much as on the other side. So here we have the two looks done. Here is Jellyfish and here is Leopard. Let me know in the comments which side you guys like more. So I went off camera to add some eyeliner, so now we have the final looks on. Before I get into my overall impressions though, I wanted to first provide you guys some comparison swatches for this new palette. So let's start with the finishing powders. So I'm going to first swatch again Diffused Light and Ethereal Light. None of these are new shades, but I figure I'll give you guys some swatches in case it's helpful for deciding whether to pick up this palette. So next to those two, I'm going to swatch Dim Light from the Sculpture palette. So you guys can see just how much deeper dim light is. These two look really white, whereas this one's much more peachy. Then we have Soft Light, which comes in the Unlocked palette. This one has more of a yellowy undertone. These two are definitely more kind of my skin tone, whereas these two in Jellyfish are definitely brightening. And then Elephant has dim light again, so I'm not going to swatch that again. And it also has Soft Light. So actually these two are also in Elephant. So if you have Elephant from last year, you can see how those compare. I think the ones from Jellyfish this year are quite similar / possibly the same as the ones from Butterfly last year. Now I'm going to swatch the two blushes again. So here we have the Diffused Heat blush, which is the lighter one, and then we have the new one, Rose Flush. I mean, honestly, these two look pretty similar to each other already. But for comparison, I wanted to swatch the two from Elephant last year, since these are also quite rosy toned, albeit maybe a little bit more coral. So here we have Iridescent Coral, which is a little bit more golden in undertone. And then we have Radiant Rose, which honestly looks very similar. Let me grab a little bit more of Radiant Rose, maybe just slightly more pigmented. Yeah. Alrighty, so I think if you have Elephant from last year, it's somewhat similar. I would say the shades in Elephant just stand out a little bit more in comparison to the ones in Jellyfish, which are just slightly more muted. I also wanted to compare this with Vibrant Flush from the Sculpture palette. This one is a lot lighter and also has a bit more of that coral shade to it. And then let's also just put Mood Exposure here for good measure. These really don't swatch very pigmented, so it's a little bit hard to see the differences, but this one is definitely a lot more cool toned in comparison to these. And then finally, I wanted to swatch Mood Flush from Unlocked. And this one I think is also just going to be a little bit more mauvey. So here we go. Yeah, this one's a bit more mauvey, though honestly not that different from the new Rose Flush shade. So I think on the face, all of these don't look that dissimilar, just slightly different vibes. Like these two will be a bit more cool toned and mauvey. These will just be a little bit more poppy and have a bit more coral to them, whereas the two ones in Jellyfish are more subdued roses. Now let's go into bronzer comparisons. So first let's start with Lunar Bronze. I'm going to put this on the other side of my arm. There we go. Lunar Bronze from Jellyfish. And then the one that I immediately thought of was this Natural Bronze Light shade from Sculpture, because this one is also a bit more neutral and it's my current favorite from Hourglass. So you can see there, they're actually quite similar. The one in Sculpture is just a little bit more rosy, whereas the one in Jellyfish is more neutral brown. Then we have Golden Bronze Light from Unlocked. This one does have some golden shimmers in it, so that's the main difference, I would say. It's a bit warmer as well. And then from Elephant, we have Lustrous Bronze Light, which I'm anticipating to be a lot warmer. Yeah, that one has a bit more oranginess to it. And then finally, going into Tiger, we have Transcendent Light, which is actually a finishing powder, but I use it as a bronzer. So here we have all the shades. I would say this new bronzer is actually quite dissimilar from the previous ones. So if you do have a bunch of Hourglass palettes, this is probably the most unique addition that this palette provides. So now let's go into the final shade, the highlight shade. And I already know this one is going to be quite distinct, but whew, wow. Look how bright that is. It really packs quite a metallic punch. So let's go in first with Champagne Strobe Light from Unlocked. This one is way more yellow, as you can hopefully see there. Then in Tiger, we have Divine Strobe Light over here, which is kind of like a mix between the two previous ones. It has a bit of bronziness and a bit of gold. But you can see in contrast to all of these, this one's just so much brighter and more pink. And then in terms of the more subdued highlights from Hourglass, there is this highlighter from Tiger as well, which is, as you can tell, less shiny than the previous ones. And similarly, the one in Sculpture, which is glistening strobe light, is also a little bit less shiny and a bit more natural. So here are all of the highlighters. This one in Jellyfish is definitely unique. So with all of those comparison swatches out of the way, let's get into my overall thoughts about these new palettes. So first off, I'm really glad that Hourglass is now releasing palettes in multiple skin tones. If you guys watched my video last year, basically I was really excited that they finally started doing this for the first time ever last year. Up until that point, I felt like Hourglass had taken basically no steps towards inclusivity in terms of skin tones, and they still have quite a ways to go, but at least I felt like they were making a really significant step forward. So I'm glad that wasn't just a fluke, but that they have continued it into this year. I will say the deepest shades this year in Snake do seem a bit lighter in comparison to Tiger last year, mainly in that this was a finishing powder, whereas in the newest Snake palette, they have a bronzer, which is kind of a similar depth to this. So that might be kind of one slight step backward, but at least they're still trying to cater to folks with somewhat deeper skin tones. In terms of the palettes released this year, one thing I think that's really great is that all of them have bronzer, finishing powder, highlighter, and blush, so you can get a full look out of all of them, which is a huge plus to me because I love these palettes for travel, and last year's Butterfly palette was the one I passed on because it didn't have a bronzer. In terms of the Jellyfish palette, I am really glad I picked this up and also really glad that I got it in the owl packaging because I just find this super, super stunning and gorgeous. It was hard for me to decide though. I really also liked the Jellyfish packaging, and I also was a fan as well of Leopard and Snake. I initially considered getting all of them until I realized that they weren't all distinct palettes, and then, you know, I realized that Leopard didn't have that many unique shades, but I'm very glad that I picked the owl because it's just super, super beautiful. In terms of the shades inside, I am really happy with the look I got today. In general, recently I've been going for slightly more natural looks, and so I feel like this kind of look is really up my alley. I'm a huge fan of this bronzer. I love that it's a lot more neutral in comparison to prior Hourglass bronzers. That for me is a major game changer in their line. I do kind of wish the two blushes were slightly more dissimilar in that I like, for example, how in Leopard you're able to either go more warm toned or more cool toned. That's something I also really love in the Sculpture palette, which is my current ride or die Hourglass palette, and I think still overall the one I would recommend the most. But I do feel like Jellyfish is gonna give it a run for its money and that it is just so beautiful. In terms of this highlighter, I feel like this is a little bit brighter than I would normally go for. I think it's beautiful for glam looks like today, but typically I would want something a bit more muted. I'm really glad these two finishing powders work well for my skin tone. That was something I was quite worried about. But even though they look white and pan, I feel like they're sheer enough on the skin that they still work for me. In terms of Leopard, if I didn't have my existing palettes, I would definitely go out and buy this as well because I feel like this is beautiful. Mood Exposure, as I've mentioned, is my #1 favorite Hourglass blush and potentially one of my all-time favorite blushes in general. So getting that is a huge plus. I also love that you have 2 additional blush shades, so you have a lot of that versatility. The bronzer is a bit warmer than I normally like, so I don't find myself actually reaching for this bronzer that much, but I do really love the diffused light finishing powder. That's one that I do use very often and can definitely vouch for. So on the whole, I think this one is great for folks who have either slightly warmer complexions or like a look that's just a little bit more eye-catching than what Jellyfish offers. Now, before we close out this video, I also just wanted to give you guys a quick wear test update on the skin tint. It's looking really good, and that's actually really impressive to me because, as I mentioned at the top, I don't normally get along with Hourglass complexion products, but so far this is looking really, really beautiful, especially with the other Hourglass powders layered on top. I think this is a really lovely look and really lightweight and luminous for an everyday basis. So I'll keep trying this out and let you guys know, but did just want to give that quick plug based on this initial 1 hour into the wear test. So that's it for today's video. If you guys like this video, please give it a thumbs up, and if you haven't already, please subscribe to my channel. I'd love to hear in the comments what you guys think about this release and if you're picking up any of the palettes. Let me know also if you've tried them and what your thoughts have been. Thank you all so much for joining me today, and I'll catch you next time. Bye!